Hello and welcome to Unity Presbyterian Church Online. This week in worship, Pastor Dana concludes our summer series on questions with a look at forgiveness. Let's listen.
Today we are wrapping up our summer sermon series on questions, and today we're going to tackle a couple of questions, all of which center around the topic of forgiveness. So the first question says, if I am forgiven, why do I not feel so? And the other question is, what if I cannot forgive someone? So basically this question is asking, how do I forgive myself? And then the second question is a two-parter. How do I forgive others? And what do I do if I can't seem to find forgiveness in my heart? And as it turns out, there's a story in Scripture about this very thing. Can you believe it? There is a story that deals with real life problems. This story is about the prodigal son. And in that story, there are three voices. We have the prodigal son who has asked for his inheritance early. We have the father who has handed over the inheritance. And then we have the other son, the brother, who's angry at his brother who asked for the inheritance early and abandoned the family on the farm. So among these three voices, we have the prodigal son who has forgiven himself. Now he's seeking forgiveness from his family. We have the dad who has chosen to forgive his son. And then we have the other son who's refusing forgiveness. So we're going to take a look at this story. We're going to get a big, broad perspective by reading the entire story. And then we'll look a little bit closer at some of the details and the nuances of the forgiveness that's wrapped up here. So turning to Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. It says, a man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now, before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. But no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have enough food to spare, and here I am, dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. His father said to him, Look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found. This parable is about a young man who wanted to be rich and was eager to live this posh lifestyle. He was so eager for this type of living that he turned to his father and asked for his inheritance early, which was a cold slap in the face to his father. And his father loved his son very much. He actually says yes. He hands over the inheritance. And the youngest son runs off to some first century location that could be comparable to Las Vegas. He squanders all of his inheritance and eventually is reduced to eating beans and mush and working on a hog farm. And that's about the time the young man has this epiphany, and he realizes that this seemingly brilliant idea was actually a terrible idea. And so he decides to tuck his tail between his legs. He's planning to go back to the family farm and to grovel for the father's forgiveness. And this is where we encounter the first voice, the voice of the prodigal son who has tucked his tail between his legs. He is humbly seeking forgiveness from his father. And it's through this first illustration that we see what all it entails. To one, forgive yourself, but to also seek forgiveness from other people. And first, it entails introspection, really taking the time to think about and reflect on the things that we have done wrong, to think about the behaviors we demonstrated, the inappropriate way we may have treated another person. And it's through that process of introspection that a person is truly humbled as you become viscerally aware of what you have done. Forgiving yourself, it entails taking time for introspection about what occurred, learning the lesson that is entangled in that story, and then letting God's grace and love and mercy and forgiveness penetrate your heart. And I think it's that part that's the hardest. Right? I think as human beings, it is so easy to beat ourselves up and to hang on to guilt and shame instead of realizing that God's love is unconditional, that God's grace and forgiveness is never earned, it is freely given. But as forgiveness does penetrate our hearts, that's what truly allows us to free ourselves from the guilt and shame. So this voice of the prodigal son helps to see how you get to the point of seeking forgiveness from someone else. How first you begin by forgiving yourself, by being honest and humble about what you've done, and then receiving God's grace and forgiveness in your heart. Now the second voice, the voice of the Father who is granting the forgiveness, it also requires a healthy, heavy dose of humility as well. When the prodigal son humbly returned home seeking forgiveness, the father was waiting for him. He was ready to embrace his son. He ran to greet him. The actions demonstrated by the father, where he's waiting for his son to return and where he runs to greet him, this illustrates humility because it completely defied cultural and societal norms of that time. First, according to Palestinian norms, which is where this parable was taking place, a father who had been shamed by a son in this way, where the son had asked for their inheritance early, well, that child would have been disowned. It would have been customary to disown him, to never speak to him again. So customarily, the son would not have been warmly embraced. He would have been greeted with a cold, blank stare and a closed door. And second, the father defies societal and cultural norms by running to embrace his son. In ancient times, a dignified man did not run. A man did not hike up his expensive long robe, exposing his hairy Middle Eastern legs, because that was considered to be humiliating, according to Palestinian customs. And a man did not run in sandals on a dusty, rocky road. Not only were the sandals not conducive for running on those types of road, but that sort of behavior was not typical. It was not customary. And thirdly, not only did the father break societal and cultural norms by running to take his son back, but he welcomed him back in the most extravagant way possible. The father commanded his servants to go and get his son a robe and a ring and a pair of sandals. The robe that the son received, this was a symbol that he was an honored guest. The ring symbolized authority, and the sandals symbolized the fact that he was a free man. Only slaves were the ones who didn't wear sandals. So with this second illustration of forgiveness in our parable, we see what granting forgiveness entails. It entails defying societal and cultural norms at times, not doing the things that someone else might deem as a fair or just reaction. It entails humbling yourself, saying, "It is okay that you have hurt me in this way. I still love you. You are still my son." Granting forgiveness entails choosing love and compassion over and above contempt or revenge. So with the second voice of forgiveness, we're able to see that granting forgiveness entails a deep, expansive love, uncustomary compassion, and humility. Now our third and final voice, the voice of the other son, the brother who is refusing forgiveness, he illustrates for us what happens when we refuse forgiveness. His voice helps to illustrate how sometimes it is hard to forgive someone that has wronged us. Sometimes it is difficult to find our words of forgiveness. The other son who didn't break Palestinian customs by asking for his inheritance early, the one who has demonstrated his loyalty to the family by staying on the farm, he is furious that his brother is able to run off, and yet he's welcomed back so graciously. And it's through this voice that we encounter rage, anger, contempt, as he refuses to forgive his brother. And it's through his illustration that we encounter the saddest part of the entire story, where we watch this brother stay bound up in his anger and resentment. I want to share a story with you all this morning. It's a story about Jean Bishop. Jean Bishop is a criminal defense lawyer. She's an activist. She's an author. She's written many books on the topic of forgiveness. This is a picture of her and one of the books that she has written. It's called Grace from the Rubble. Forgiveness is a topic that Jean has spent most of her life trying to understand. And she's spent most of her life trying to understand it because of a traumatic event that she went through. In April of 1990, Jean's sister, Nancy, and her brother-in-law, Robert, were murdered in their home right outside of Chicago. The killer was a 16-year-old boy who was a friend of the family. He was later diagnosed as a sociopath. But the 16-year-old had broken into Nancy and Robert's home while they were out to dinner with the rest of the family. They were celebrating Nancy's news that she was pregnant. And so when they returned home, the 16-year-old shot Richard and Nancy, therefore killing their unborn child as well. 6 months after the murders, the police arrested David Biro. He was an honor student at his high school. He had already been admitted to the hospital once, a psychiatric hospital, for trying to poison his family. He denied murdering Nancy and Robert, but eventually he was sentenced to life in prison without parole at the age of 16. Fast forwarding 20 years. After the sentencing, things changed for Jean, where she was picnicking with her 7 and 11-year-old sons. And during that picnic, her oldest son said, "Mom, we have to forgive the man who murdered Aunt Nancy and Uncle Robert because God made him for a purpose too." And so Jean was struck by the truth of her child's statement, and she wrote her sister's murderer. She wrote a letter of forgiveness and offered to see him. And so he responded with a 15-page letter that was an apology and taking responsibility for the murder. The humble forgiveness that was exchanged between the two of them resulted in a powerful and dramatic transformation in Jean's heart. She actually began working on the killer's behalf to gain his parole. And she became an activist for abolishing the death sentence and campaigning against what she called merciless sentences for juvenile offenders. As you might imagine, this was not well received by her family. They couldn't understand her transformation of heart, and so many of them disowned her. But she stayed true to what she believed was the right thing to do, and she experienced the transformative power of forgiveness, where she was freed from the bondage of anger and wrath and resentment. Sometimes forgiveness entails defying cultural and societal norms and not doing what others would deem as a right and just reaction. Forgiveness, both giving and receiving, it entails a heavy dose of introspection and humility. Forgiveness is hard to grant sometimes, but it is only through that process that we experience this transformation in our heart, where we are actually freed from the anger and the resentment. A wise fellow Presbyterian minister once said, "Forgiveness is to make a conscious choice to release the person who has wounded us from the sentence of our judgment, however justified that judgment may be. It represents a choice to leave behind our resentment and our desire for retribution, however fair such punishment may seem. Forgiveness means that the power of the original wounds to hold us trapped is broken." Indeed, the saddest part of our parable this morning is that the older brother allowed himself to remain bound up in his bitterness, trapped in his wrath and resentment. But there is profound joy in the story when the prodigal son returns home and his father runs to embrace him. There is profound joy for all of us to experience as well when we live in relationship with others in that same way, where compassion, love, humility, and forgiveness trumps everything else. Now, I know that sometimes it is hard to forgive certain people, and sometimes it's difficult to find your own words of forgiveness. I cannot fully wrap my mind around how Jean was able to petition for her sister's murderer to be released from prison. But I do know that there is power in forgiveness. And I know that when we do choose to forgive, it frees us from so many harmful feelings and emotions. There are times when the act is too big for us to forgive on our own, and I believe that Jesus knew that. I believe that Jesus knew that there would be certain times and certain situations that we wouldn't be able to do it all by ourselves, and that we wouldn't be able to find our words of forgiveness. And I truly believe that that is one reason why he gave us the Lord's Prayer, because tucked there in the middle of that prayer is a powerful sentence about forgiveness. It's about forgiving, but also offering forgiveness and seeking forgiveness. It says, "And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." I remember years ago talking to a woman. She was a mom, and her daughter was grown, and she had gotten involved in an abusive relationship. She had turned to drugs and alcohol, and I remember this woman just expressing her anger about this and how she was seeking to try and forgive this gentleman for destroying her daughter's life. And she said, "I just cannot find my own words." And so for years, she said she would pray for this man. She would imagine his face and just pray the Lord's Prayer over and over again. That those were the only words of forgiveness that she could find. In those times when you find it difficult to forgive other people, when you can't find your own words, when you can't even fathom how forgiveness could transpire, I invite you to just simply pray the Lord's Prayer, to rely on Jesus' words, to bring healing to your hearts, grace to your lips. In closing, I leave you with a passage from Paul's letter to the Ephesians as we continue to ponder this topic of forgiveness, both how we forgive ourselves and how we forgive other people. It says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." Amen.
If you would like more information about Unity Presbyterian Church, please visit our website at www.unitypres.org or visit us on Facebook. This is the Unity Presbyterian Church Podcast. Have a great week.